Our thesis today is going to be, we are given gifts we must make use of if we want to be saved. Will we be praised upon entering heaven? Is trusting without works the path to salvation? Or will we find that cooperation with grace is needed to be saved? Today, we will be talking about all of these things and providing answers. Welcome everyone to Crux Sacra Apologetics. In this video, we will be starting off a new series where we will be exegetically covering the parables of Jesus. What we will be discovering with each and every one of these parables is that all explicitly talk about salvation, or they go over what we need in order to be saved. You would think that people would go to the parables far more often, since there is rarely a topic I find more talked about, especially in Protestant circles, than salvation itself. You can hear about how to be saved more than any other Christian message most typically. However, when this is usually done, it is under the Protestant schema of understanding things, that is, that we are saved by faith alone, apart from all works. Now, I do not believe that this message of sola fide is the gospel, and sometimes Protestants will admit that. Not that sola fide isn't the gospel, but that you have to go to the writings of Paul in order to see this message clearly, and not first to the four Gospels of Jesus. I have no doubt that there are plenty of passages in Paul that are commonly used in argument for sola fide, not that it's justified. However, we have to be extremely cautious whenever someone says that we should build our theological grounds on Paul first in order to then reinterpret everything that Jesus says in the Gospels. It always seemed rather odd that people would go to Paul first and then say, once you've understood Paul, then you can read Jesus. Wouldn't it make more sense to go to Jesus first and then understand Paul afterwards? Now, a counter-argument for this would be to say that Paul is far easier to read than Jesus, that his messages are more clear than Jesus's, and that Jesus deliberately attempted to make his lessons obscure through the teaching of the parables. We know that Jesus wasn't deliberately trying to be confusing with the parables, not in a deceitful way. Jesus says that the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven had been granted to some, but not to others. So these parables can be understood. They are not meaningless or misleading stories, only that some people won't understand them, and that some people will understand them. What we cannot say is that Jesus has bad logic, or that his analogies don't actually explain the kingdom of heaven or salvation. So I don't buy the excuse in saying, because Jesus deliberately kept the mysteries from some people, therefore we cannot go to Jesus first before we go to Paul. Now, to this, some people may say, in order that we be of the people who understand the parables, we need to first read Paul. Then we will be adept to understand the mysteries Jesus was teaching in the parables. This is not actually what the Bible says. We actually find Peter giving a warning against those who are reading Paul's letters and leading themselves into destruction because of it. We read in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 to 16, "And regard the patience of our Lord as salvation. So also our beloved brother Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, speaking of this as he does in all his letters. There are some things in them hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. Therefore, as you can see, it is very possible to distort the teachings of Paul into destructive doctrines. There isn't a warning about this in concerns to Jesus' sayings, and if Jesus' sayings were more difficult than Paul's, we would expect this warning to be applied to Jesus instead. Rather, we find Peter saying that in Paul's writings are things that are difficult to understand. This would not be a reference just to the unimportant teachings of Paul that do not affect salvation, because Peter says that the difficult passages are twisted to their destruction, meaning that the passages in Paul, or at least some of the passages in Paul, are relating to salvation, and twisting them could put your salvation in jeopardy. Because of all of this, we are going to be taking a different approach. In Jesus' parables, we can see his true teachings, that they do not easily fit with the Protestant schema of sola fide, not even at all. And once we understand the doctrines of Jesus, we can then better make sense of Paul's writings so that we do not ignorantly twist them unto destruction, as Peter warns about. What we are going to find is that each of the parables of Jesus directly contradict the notion of being saved by faith alone, apart from all works. This is not going to be a time when we're going to cross-examine these parables with other outside verses. My invitation for those joining us during our readings of the parables will be to purely focus on them alone, so that we can see what the natural lessons of these parables would be if we were truly unbiased. Now, we're all imperfect people. I am not claiming to be perfect at all. However, if we go through every parable and find that the natural reading of each and every one of them don't allow for the possibility of sola fide, then we would have to conclude that understanding salvation in that way would be incorrect and contrary to Jesus. So, our first parable is going to be the parable of the talents. We are going to read through it, and then we're going to break down what the details of this parable are. Hopefully, we can all agree to the bare facts, and then from those facts, we will deduce what the parable could be saying, and also what this parable could not be saying by natural deduction. Because the one thing that we cannot say is that Jesus is putting forth an analogy that does not align with how salvation is. If you think Jesus is being so obscure in these parables that the stories he puts forth are not accurate to salvation, then you are claiming that Jesus' logic is not accurate to salvation, or that he's being deliberately deceitful to the people about the nature of salvation. So, let us begin. The parable of the talents is only found in one place, and this is going to be in Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30, where we read, "For it is as if a man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them, and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So let's try to summarize the details. We have a master who's going on a journey, and he summons his servants to him. He gives one 5 talents, he gives one 2 talents, and he gives one 1 talent, and then he goes away. He checks with them all, and the first one says that he made another 5 talents from the 5 he was given. From here, the master says, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." The same happens with the servant who had 2 talents. He made 2 more, and the master praises him in the same way. Now we have the one servant who was given the 1 talent, but produced none. Having feared the master as a harsh man, he hid the talent in the ground so he wouldn't lose it, and then gave it back to the master. For this, the master calls him a wicked and lazy slave. And what he condemns him for is very interesting. He says that he should have at least had given the money to the bankers, so he would have gained interest on the talent. But he didn't even do that. He takes away his talent and gives it to the one with 10, only to then cast out that slave into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there are a couple things that we can make clear. This is Judgment Day, where the master will judge his servants and give them blessing or punishment. The 2 first servants were promised that they would be in charge of many things and share in the master's joy. So this would be salvation. The last servant, who was called worthless, was thrown out into the outer darkness, so this would be condemnation. Therefore, we can see that this parable is distinctly about salvation, about those who will be saved and those who will be condemned. The question then becomes, what is the criteria for salvation or condemnation? Is it faith alone, apart from all works? That is not what we find. There are several things that contradict that theology in this parable. What's odd is that we don't see the master giving them a direct order. Maybe it's implied that he did, but all we see is that he gave talents according to each one's ability. I think that really shows through in how one servant takes 5 and makes 5, and how another takes 2 and makes 2, and both are rewarded the same. Therefore, salvation is not predicated on the inherent worth of our merits. Otherwise, we would find that one servant to be vastly more rewarded than the other, or that the one who made the most gets salvation, and those who aren't up to spec don't get salvation. So no, this isn't Pelagian. We don't find that the inherent worth of the works is what grants salvation. But if we do want to find a difference between the 2 who are saved, we do find that the one who had 10 talents is blessed slightly more because he receives the 1 talent of the lazy servant. Other than that, we still find that the servant with 4 talents still has salvation, just like the servant with 10 talents. So I think this is a clear comparison to show that it's not about how much works in as much as they did in accordance with what they were given. Another thing that is immensely interesting is the praise that the master gives them. Now, what we all should understand is that Protestantism is a meritless system because they believe salvation has no works, and when we are saved, it is not in part at all because of anything that we did that remotely deserves praise. So for this parable to be accurate to salvation, it should be that the servants are not praised at all for anything, because in the Protestant understanding, those who find salvation did nothing of praise in order to be saved. So how can we understand why the master praises the 2 servants? If they did nothing of merit or nothing of praise, then why does he praise them? That doesn't match up at all. It would not make sense to the Protestant why, upon entering heaven, our Father will say to us, "Well done, good and trustworthy servant." In the bottom of my heart, that is what I long for, and perhaps all of you long for, to reach the end of our lives, to enter into heaven, and to hear our Father say, "Well done, good and trustworthy son or daughter." That may resonate with you as it does with me, but this is what we find in this parable, that the master says this same line to those who served him well. Now, some may think of this as a counter-argument, but I think it only strengthens the case, which is what the word here for trustworthy is in both of these cases. The word for trustworthy is actually faith, or faithful. This Greek word being piste and pistos. So some may say this is where faith alone slips in, that we aren't judged for our works at all, but for our faith alone. That is not actually what we find here. Yes, we do need faith unto God. We are not saying that is unnecessary. We are saying that faith is required. But faith is not mere intellectual assent or trust. What we find here is that the master in this verse is saying that each servant is good and faithful. This isn't because they merely trusted the master, but that they worked and served him well while they were away from him. Because the master then says, "Over a few things you were faithful, therefore over many things they will be set over." So what we find is that the servants were good and faithful, and they were faithful in their work, which helps the definition of what faithful means, that it is linked to loyal service and devotion. That faith isn't just in our hearts, but also in our works, and that our faith without works would be dead. Let's also not forget that the master first calls them good. Now, no one is good like God, sure, but this doesn't stop the master from calling his servants good. This is entirely contradictory to the Protestant schema, which says we are not good unless we have the imputed righteousness of Christ covering us so that we look good on the outside, even if we aren't good on the inside. In fact, if we produce a bunch of works in order to impress God, according to Protestantism, that would be seen as dirty rags. That hoping to gain God's favor through our works is seen as a sin and an offense. Therefore, the two servants who received gifts from the master go out and work with those gifts, and then bring the fruit of those gifts back to the master, shouldn't be praised as good or faithful, but as vain and foolish. According to Protestantism, it is arrogant to think that our works could contribute to our salvation, and even to think that could be a sin of itself. Under Protestantism, the master should be condemning these servants, not praising them. But that's not what we find. The master praises the servants for accepting the gifts he gave them and producing fruit with those gifts. And for being faithful and good in this way, the master grants them salvation. On the other hand, it's actually the last servant who appears to take on the ideology of Protestantism. His thoughts aren't explained completely. All he says is that he knows the master is a harsh man, reaping where he does not sow, and gathering where he does not scatter. This could imply that the master expects the very best of people, and that the servant was afraid that his works wouldn't be up to standard. Therefore, to cut his losses, he buried his talent. So this servant did not bring the fruit of his labor, but didn't work, and without any fruit to show for it, he gave back what the master gave him, as if he would be satisfied with only what he was originally given to him, instead of anything added to it. This is rather close to the idea of trusting in God for salvation, and that your works wouldn't be good enough to even contribute to salvation. But this is not the attitude that is rewarded by the master. The master calls this servant wicked and lazy. Now, when I always heard this, the lazy part always made sense to me. The other servants went out and worked with the gifts that they were given. This last servant did not, so we can see the laziness there. But why is he wicked? That part never made sense to me. Other translations call him evil, but why is he evil? I believe it was because he was self-centered. He was afraid of the master's judgment. He didn't want to risk displeasing him, so he didn't put trust in his own works. He preserved what his master gave him and gave it back to him upon his return. So under that context, I was starting to understand why the servant was called wicked or evil, because he was only concerned with himself and wasn't driven by love and faithfulness towards his master, like the other two servants were. Therefore, the servant, who was focused on his own saving and not in serving his master, is condemned as both wicked and lazy. So, let's recap. All three servants were given gifts according to their ability. 2 produced fruits according to what they were given. The third did not work and produced no fruits. When the master returned, he called the first 2 good and faithful servants and granted them salvation. With the third, even though he kept what the master gave him, he was condemned as wicked and lazy and cast out into the darkness of condemnation. So what we find, if we were to just focus on this parable, is that God first graces us. We don't automatically have these gifts, and we can't be good on our own. But after having received God's grace, we are then to use our gifts or our talents to produce good fruit. And the reasoning behind why the 2 first servants were given salvation was because they were good and faithful. And don't miss this, they were faithful in small matters. The third servant was neither of these 3 things, neither being good or faithful in his works. Even though he kept the grace, let's say, of the master, he did not cooperate with the graces that he was given, being fearful of the master's judgment and that his work wouldn't have held up against it. He worked not and trusted that he still would be saved. But that is not what happened. The master took what he had and casted him out. That talent was then given to the one with 10 talents. And this is where we find a common phrase of Jesus, that for those who have, more will be given, and to those who have not, even what little he has will be taken away. This is also antithetical to Protestant salvation. The idea is that we are completely meritless, that only those who realize that we have nothing and put their faith in Jesus as a completely non-meritorious act are saved. So only those who realize that they have nothing are the ones who reach salvation. And those who believe they have something in the eyes of God are the ones who will be condemned. This is precisely the opposite of what Jesus says at the end of this parable, that it's not those who have nothing that will receive everything. It is those who have who will receive, and those who have not will have all taken from them. Therefore, we cannot say that those who are saved are the ones who have nothing and do only non-meritorious acts. Otherwise, we would say that they have something before God. As we will find, it is those who have who will be given more. And we can't even say this thing that they supposedly had is faith, because under sola fide, even faith is a non-meritorious act, which does not count for anything. Therefore, we do need to have something in order to be given more. So, let's conclude on what the parable says. We can't be good without God gracing us first. We have to actively use the graces we were given. If we produce good fruit, we will be praised as good and faithful servants and enter into salvation. If we do not produce good fruit by the graces we have been given, we shall find ourselves wicked and lazy, self-centered and unloving towards God, and we will be cast out into condemnation. Notice that this formula is not Pelagian. It is not a work-centered theology, that we need no graces from the Father, and that we are automatically able to do good all on our own. That is not the case here. We need grace from God. From that moment, however, we are in His good graces. But there are things that we need to do to remain in His good graces, and to be further glorified in heaven afterwards. If we don't, we find that there are things, or even sins of omission, that we can commit in order to lose the grace we were given, just like how the third servant lost the talent he was given by the master. So in conclusion, we're going to wrap up with a reflection question, and our question is going to be this: did works play a role in the salvation or condemnation of the servants? What we're going to find is, yes, they did play a role, and it was their absence or presence that affected their fates. However, these works are not in absence of the virtues that were within them, since the first two were praised as good and faithful, and the last servant was condemned as wicked and lazy. So, it is as the Protestants say, that we cannot earn our salvation by the sheer merit of the works alone. Rather, by the grace we have been given by God freely as a gift, according to the abilities He's given us, we are to work out our love and faithfulness for Him if we want to be saved, lest we lose the grace He's given us. Alright, I'm hoping to go over as many parables as we can on this channel. If you want more in-depth studies of these parables in relation to Catholic salvation, be sure to like and subscribe so you can stay tuned for future videos. That is all we are going to have for today, but until next time, thank you all for watching.